Hello and welcome to the 5th edition of the Goa Arts and Literary Festival 2014. I have here with me Professor Mustansir Dalvi, who teaches the College of Sir J.J. College of Architecture. Now I'd like to ask you about architecture and art. Since we are in the Goa Arts and Literary Festival.
Uh, what is the relationship between architecture and art? Well, they are one and the same thing to a very large extent. Art has elements of architecture in it, depending on what kind of art is made, like, say, large installations or sculptures. But all architecture can be seen to be art because it is predominantly a visual medium. Of course, it's a medium which you also occupy, so there is a functional aspect to it. But you may say that they are parts of the same thing.
So earlier last year you had gone to the Delhi for the Future of Cities conference, in which you talked against urbanization of cities and how that separates communities. So what do you have to say about that?
Uh, that's the wrong notion. I would never be against urbanization. Urbanization is what keeps us civilized. That is a very important part of our world and the way we live in and all our interactions. I have problems about things within the way urbanization is looked at today, and I have some issues with the way our cities are being very quickly transformed, not so much for the purpose of the people who live in it, but as units of making money. These are issues that I have serious problems with, not urbanization.
And like you're a very artistic, very spiritual person. Even in your blogs, you have a lot of translations of poems. That is, as any of you'll know. And would you like to talk about the inspiration of that URL that you created on your blog?
Well, I've chosen As Any Fuel Know, and that comes straight from the series of books written by Jeffrey Willens on a totally misbehaving, very bad schoolboy called Molesworth, who writes in the first person about his life in English schools but can't spell for nuts. And As Any Fuel Know is part of that text. It's a phrase which he keeps using on and on, but instead of fool, he says FULE.
Right.
Yeah.
And we talked about your poem. He's got a book of poems that's come out in Brouhahas of Cox, in which he talks about many scenarios. Like one of the poems in which it's by a first-person view of how he's taking a picture of a landscape. And where do you get the inspiration of these poems?
In this book, Brouhahas of Cox, I have chosen poems that I have written which are in specific locations. So there are poems written, say for example, several poems are located in New Bombay, where I live. Several poems are located in Kerala. There are one or two poems located in Goa, and so on. I was very interested in the way sites, places have impacted me when I have traveled through them or lived in them. And so most of the poems are based on that.
So you're a person who likes the communities to be well intact, and well, everyone does, but you have really strong opinions on that. So what would you like to have in a ideal city?
Well, an ideal city has to be an inclusive city. And I have lived for a large part of my life in Bombay, which has been probably the best example of an inclusive city. For example, there are several streets in Bombay even today where in the buildings that line the streets, some of the richest people in Bombay live cheek by jowl with some of the poorest. And that is how this kind of camaraderie and togetherness kind of led to the development of the city over the past 150 years. That is something I would like to see preserved.
And what would you say, like you've got the blog, what do you say that has like a new medium such as that to send as a medium to send this literature to people? What's the role of that right now?
It's exactly what you say. It's a new medium which allows me to reach an audience very quickly, and it allows me something that in the old medium I would never have had, feedback. So there is, in a sense, a blog is a conversation, but it is a conversation at a more leisurely pace. One takes time to read, one doesn't have to respond instantly, and it also allows me to put out the things that I do, things like writing, I write articles, pieces, or I even translate. So whenever I do that, I can put it out on my blog, and I'm ensured of very erudite responses, which is something I use all the time to get better at, and I can learn from them.
So for all those people who are really interested in writing poems, I mean, since like I've seen the JJ College of the campus, it is brilliant. You get inspiration just in walking inside the campus. What would you say? Like, what particular area should a person concentrate on to get this kind of a flow of writing?
For writing poems,
Yes.
read poems. There is no other way.
And any examples?
Well, I can tell you inspirations from myself. One of my favorite poets is the Indian poet Arun Kolatkar. And if you read his poems, you will really be inspired to think in that way and write. I would always say that reading Arun Kolatkar gave me the freedom to kind of write my own poems. So, as an example, yeah. But then there are so many poets in India and all over the world whom you can definitely read and learn from.
And you said there are two poems based from Goa, as in inspired by Goa.
Yes.
So, like, would you like to say something more on that?
Yeah, sure. One poem is based on this very interesting place in Goa, which is a very small restaurant. And if you go inside that restaurant, everything around you is dedicated to Elvis Presley. So I went there once and had a drink, and I enjoyed myself completely. So one poem is that. The other poem is on football.
Two things synonymous to Goa. I mean, not Elvis Presley, but whatever.
Elvis Presley is synonymous with Goa in one sense.
And so, as in going back to the fact that you've contributed a lot of articles, and I've read a few of your expressions in the way you expect communities to behave and how they stay. And what do you think is changing? What do you think is are people actually going in the right direction, in your opinion?
Well, it depends. In say, one of the problems that has happened after liberalization and globalization is that it has made at least some parts of our urban community more affluent. So they have more money to spend, and there is this great drive towards consumerism and so on. And what has come with that is an aspiration, and everything seems to be driven by trying to fulfill the aspirations. Interestingly, the aspirations are only fulfilled not by coming together but by breaking apart and getting into one's exclusive domain, and a domain that is protected and shielded from the outside world. And I don't think that's really the way to go for communities in the future.
But you're a professor, so you see a lot of young people around, and there's a saying that if there's youth, there's hope. Do you see hope in the youth today?
Oh yes, of course. I'm very happy to say that the best of the best students whom I am very privileged and honored to interact with and teach are probably much better than the best of the best when I was a student. So yes, of course.
So on a concluding note, what do you say about on poems? Would you like to compare architecture to poems? I mean, your liking.
I don't know how to answer that. Probably no. These are different things, and we can hear about cliches like poetry in architecture, and we can hear about cliches like concrete poems. But I think they all have their own space and their own location. There is no comparison, I think, in that sense.
So that was Mr. Mustansir Dalvi with us at the 5th edition of the Goa's Arts and Literary Festival 2014.